When did your something is very wrong here feeling turned out to be true? We had a neighbor who made me feel very uncomfortable. One day, he leaned in the doorway of my bedroom, and I got an immediate get the FCK out of here vibe. I turned, walked under the weird loop bridge he was making with his arm, all without responding to him. He asked, "Where are you going?" My family was with his. These families had been friends for about 35 years at this point, and he knew I was alone. I was a 9-year-old boy. He was a 30-year-old man. The second I rounded the corner, I ran out of the house and rejoined the cookout. He was later convicted of molesting his son, who was about my age, and I'd already been molested once in my life by someone else. So my mind was like, dude, I can only suppress so much. Get the FCK out of here now. Double quote. Mum sat me down when I was 18. Already in tears proclaiming she had something serious to tell me. Being the sarcastic and nervous FCK I am, I turned and joked, "What? Is dad not my real dad anymore?" Double quote. Welp. Folks, have a friend that would essentially answer a text message during sex. He was that attached to his phone. He didn't get back to me one day and I noticed his FB hadn't been updated yet. I tried hitting him up a few more times. Something didn't feel right. Told a few friends. Most wrote it off as nothing. Because this guy always seems happy. He lives like an hour away. Finally I get someone to go with me to hang out with him. Worst case, we'd say we were gonna be in the neighborhood, that's why we were hitting him up. Had we not done that, he was going to kill himself that night. We showed up and he just started crying immediately and saying that he needed help. We outright intervened in a friend's suicide. He was always so active on social media as a way to hide his depression. It chills me to this day that if maybe I don't write him and get a strange odd feeling that a friend might not be here today. Edit. A quick follow up. He's actually quite good now. He struggles still but will talk about it and allows us a bit more into his life so that we can help. He's got issues that I myself have, but would never mention it before. So now we can talk about a lot more things. But overall, he got the help he needed and lives pretty well these days. My mom and dad had this friend that I hated. I thought he was just creepy and weird, and when I'd tell them I hated him they were like, "Be nice." Blah blah blah. Turns out he molested his stepchildren, now he's in jail. I think these unconscious feelings we get are really important and can be extremely beneficial if we learn to listen to them. But we're taught from early on to ignore them and act opposite what they tell us. That's a dangerous game to play. There is such a thing as a feeling of impending doom when your body is like, yo, you are about to die. It is a real thing. I had not been feeling well, and all of a sudden I sat up and had a distinct feeling of, you are going to die soon if you don't do something. I drove myself to the ER and on the way was getting chest pains. I went in, told them, and they took me to the back. After some tests there were a lot of people around me injecting me with a lot of different stuff. Turns out I had a pulmonary embolism, blood clot in my lung, which at any second could have gone to my brain and killed me then and there. The doctors said if I had left it any longer I would have been dead. Thanks brain. Edit. I am getting a few messages about a clot going from your lung to your brain. And I guess that can't happen. I think they probably told me the clot could have either gone to my lung or brain. I was on a lot of morphine. Close bracket. The end of April. My friend and I were to meet up for drinks. He didn't show. Didn't answer his phone. Didn't respond to my texts. I knew he was dead. I got the call the next day. He died in a car crash on his way to meet me. Edit. For those who are asking why I'd immediately jump to that conclusion. He was always consistent. Always return a text quickly. Wouldn't have missed a call otherwise. It was the first nice day. He had his sporty car out. Driving too fast. 4 students of mine won the first prize for a project they did and we all got a free trip to London. We had spent the day sightseeing and were exhausted, so we got an ice cream and sat on a bench in a park to relax. A couple of minutes later I noticed this couple walk by slowly. staring at us. My spidey senses go mental. I do not like these people for some reason. She walks by and sits on the bench next to ours and he sits on the bench across from hers. They aren't talking, just looking at each other. And that is when I notice her reaching into her pockets. I jump up, grab my students and run out of the park. My poor students are confused AF and wondering WTF is wrong with me. When all of a sudden we hear screaming. Turns out she stabbed a couple walking through the park, trying to rob them. It scares the ever-loving FCK out of me knowing had I not gotten my students out of there, we would have been stabbed and robbed. Edit. After reading all the comments, I would like to say that even though that did happen to us, London is a failure-ite destination of mine. I've been back twice since then. I just avoid parks lol. Also, thank you for the gold. Close bracket. I worked at a fast food restaurant and I got an antsy phone call from my dad telling me to come home ASAP. There were storms on the way and he was nervous about the timing. I thought he was being paranoid until I got this really uneasy feeling as well. Every nerve in my body was telling me to get home right now. I pissed off the manager when I left without mopping the floors. I rushed home and I had barely gotten into the door for 2 minutes before a tornado hit our house. Looking back on it, if I didn't leave when I did, I would have been driving along the road the tornado followed and I probably wouldn't be here. I got written up at work for leaving without completing my tasks, but a write-up is better than being dead. Family friend from my uncle's church was on vacation with us when I was around 11 or 12. I wanted to go for a walk in the woods. My mom said no. He jumped in and insisted he would go with me. She says yes. As we're walking I'm getting this weird vibe from the guy. He keeps insisting on taking pictures of me. I keep getting more creeped out. Eventually he's got my cornered and my mind just goes into total fight or flight. He's got his hands on my thighs and there's nowhere I can go, so I'm plotting in my head how I'll launch myself at him and gouge his eyes out. Just as I'm about to make my move, a relative who knew he was a pedo and was worried about what would happen makes his presence known. A few years later the family friend went to prison for raping a bunch of kids, including most of my cousins. I'm pretty sure I was almost raped that day. I was at my grandparents for a gathering and me and some of the other older kids were playing catch or tag in the front yard. I can't exactly remember. Doesn't matter. The younger kids were playing in the backyard, doing whatever the hell kids do. While playing, I could swear I heard a crying, wailing, screaming sound. But it was very quiet and distant. It was one of the most horrific screams I've ever heard. But I asked the others and they didn't hear a thing. And all insisted it was nothing. I don't know why but felt absolutely dreadful and terrified. Yet everything was fine. So I decided to go check it out. I run into the backyard and it turns out my little sister, 4-5 years at the time, was bleeding severely. She was covered in blood and trying to crawl towards the house. I swear it was out of a damn horror movie. Looking back I can't believe this actually happened. Long story short, my little cousin, 7-8 years at the time, decided it was a good idea to play catch with some broken glass he found in the backyard. And ended up cutting her jaw very deeply. Kids are dumb. Years ago, I'm working one morning and my fiance is off. She texts me around 10 or 11 and she says she had gone out to breakfast with her family and they bought her flowers and she was having a good morning. Blah blah. I was glad to hear that because she didn't really get along well with her family. The more the day went along, the more it all didn't sound right. Later that evening, she was acting unusual and she wouldn't tell me what was going on. So I checked the cell phone account activity and learned not only had she been texting and calling this random guy constantly, but she had been repeatedly lying to me about what she was doing or why she'd go do this and that or get off the phone with me, like to get back to work. There were so many instances where she hung up with me and immediately called him and had lengthy conversations. I then pointed at the flowers that were sitting on my table in my apartment. Really nice flowers. Vase with marbles. Probably cost $60 easily. I asked if they were from him. They were. That relationship ended right then and there. I used to clean vacant houses for a living. One day I was working at a house near the end of a dead-end street and there was maybe 6 or 7 houses on the one side of the street before an intersection with a stoplight, so it was a pretty heavy traffic area. I was cleaning out the property just fine when my spidey sense went off the charts. I was inside the house but I pretty much dropped everything. Got in my car and started to drive out of there. On the corner I saw a weird looking guy that had a nasty feeling about him. When I got home it was all over the news. That guy was now known for being a cop killer, making the start of his career right on that street corner about 15 minutes after I hoofed it. Told my boss that I wasn't going to go back to that property. He understood. Edit. A word. Friend invited me to see Great White. Was going to go but last minute changed my mind on him. He died at the station nightclub fire. I lived in the Middle East for about 9 years. One night I was out with 3 friends of mine and we were hanging out having a smoke out on the street. 2 cars pulled up and about 6-7 grown men stepped out of the car rather aggressively right in front of us. As soon as that happened, one of the guys I was with very quickly took off and another guy leaned and grabbed my shoulder and said, "Your name is Ahmed and you're Muslim." That's when I thought to myself, something is very wrong here. Double quote. Turned out this was a group of Muslim extremists and they stood really close to us and started telling us about their brotherhood. The one guy I was with who was Muslim did most of the talking until a military truck pulled up, guns drawn, and told them to FCK off. They then said that they were just chatting and causing no problems. Military asked us if we were fine and told us to stay out of this area late at night. I still have the tea stains in my pants even though this happened 10 years ago. Edit. Amazing comments and questions by everyone in the thread. I'll do my best to answer as many as I can. Clearly up one comment that I keep getting. This happened in Lebanon and yes, this is a very rare occurrence. And I was an idiot for being in that part of town at that time of night. A few years ago I was out drinking for a friend's bachelorette party. I knew I was too drunk to drive. So I called my then boyfriend for a ride. As I was hanging up the phone, I thought to myself that I should ask him to drive his car instead of his motorcycle. But I didn't say anything. On the way home, we were sideswiped by a drunk driver in a Suburban. The front wheel of the motorcycle got caught in the wheel well and she dragged us down the street for about a block and a half. The only reason she stopped was because a cop pulled her over. She was so drunk she didn't even notice that she ran us over. To add to the trust your gut thing, my boyfriend only had one helmet, and I tried to get him to wear it. But he insisted that we weren't going anywhere until I was wearing it. My head hit the pavement pretty hard, but his didn't. If I hadn't been wearing the helmet, things would have gone much differently that night. I was like 6 years old and in the backyard of my best friend neighbor swimming in a 3-foot play pool thing. She went inside to ask for something and right as she left, a guy on a motorcycle drove down the alley and stopped. The fence was a small chain link fence, so he definitely saw me and stopped. And I could see him clearly. Like 20 years later it's still so vivid. He pulled out some gloves and put them on, which is the last thing I saw him doing as I got out and ran through their garage out the front. And inside my house next door terrified. He drove around the front down the street slowly and about 10 minutes later shot 2 kids at the park at the end of my street. One day, about 2 weeks ago, I woke up and didn't feel pregnant anymore. Just found out today that the baby has no heartbeat. I knew because my breasts didn't feel full anymore. I was crying and squeezing them trying to feel the tenderness again. Miscarried a day later. The heartbreak eventually goes away but it takes time. I am so sorry. Flowers kept disappearing from the church where I did organ practice. So, the pastor asked me to keep an eye to see if I noticed anything unusual during daily practice sessions. Mid-afternoon, after area schools got out, I noticed a boy would come into the open church on his way home to pray and listen to the organ. But then, from the mirror on the console, I saw him taking flowers from the altar area just before he left. Finally, I asked him why. Turns out he was taking them to his grandmother's grave in the cemetery adjacent to the church. With tearful eyes, He said his family couldn't afford flowers, and he wanted to do something special with the ones left over from Sunday services and bring them to her grave because his grandma had loved flowers when she was still alive. Double quote. I had a co-worker who used to go to parties in high school. Several of the parties in her senior year were at some guy's farm. She went to one and bailed right away saying it felt weird. The guy who owned the farm was Robert Picton. I used to work with a guy from Robertstown near the end of events. A lot of people in town, including the guy, would buy pig meat from Robert. They ate the pigs that ate the women. My mom called me in the middle of the day on a Sunday. I was going to ignore it and just call her back later like I tend to do. Something just didn't feel right, so I picked up. She was calling to tell me the emergency squad was working on my brother and I needed to get a hold of my dad. I was on the way to a weekend in the Cape with my girlfriend when my stepdad called me. He never calls. He hates technology. He avoids email, calling, anything other than face-to-face communication at all costs. My girlfriend didn't get the same gut feeling seeing that he was calling, so she was confused when I answered my phone while driving. My mom, who had been diagnosed with lung cancer just short of 3 years prior, was in the hospital and he calmly asked if we were available. We immediately turned the car to their home. My girlfriend kept saying we didn't know enough to get scared or to react yet. Maybe it would all be okay. Saying anything she could to keep me sane on the 3-hour car ride. Maybe she was remaining positive. Maybe she truly believed it would be okay. But I knew it was too far gone. She passed about 2 hours after I arrived. Edit. Because my girlfriend is the greatest I could ask for and has helped me through the last 10 months like nobody else could have. I can't believe people would speak the way they have on here about someone they've never met and only read one sentence about. My dad had a friend that just had such a bad vibe to him. Like even if he tried to be nice it always came off as creepy. For fear of being prejudiced I decided to give him a chance and stop thinking of as a creepy individual. I start talking to him as a neighborhood and mind you I am a 12-year-old girl. He invites me into his house one day while my parents were out and I just get a sense of uneasiness. Like death was right around the corner. I decline the offer and he says alright. I forget about it till years later I revisit the neighborhood and don't see him around. My neighbors all get weird about it. No one tells me anything until an old friend pulls me aside and tells me one of the most obvious yet unnoticed thing about him. He was a child molester. The first friend that reached out to me in high school invited me to a sleepover that became a weekly occurrence. Met her stepdad. And instantly my stomach was unsettled. He was weird. Tried too hard to seem cool, strong, useful. And stuck around us when we set up the sleeping bags in the living room and hung out. I kind of understood why he lingered the first night. But the lingering continued throughout the couple of years I stayed over. I told my mum I thought he was weird and suspicious and she told me never judge a book by its cover. One day I found out that she had been continuously molested by him for years and had told her to bring friends over so he didn't molest her. Her mother admitted it was so he could groom the friends. He was physically aggressive with me one day and I never went back. Took a month or so but I couldn't take it and gathered as much evidence that I could. Things that used to mean nothing were suddenly glaringly obvious that something was wrong, and went to police. I was something I never really wanted to be true. But it had happened before. Same sort of something is very wrong here situation has happened to me a few other times with similar or same results, and I just knew that I couldn't be wrong but I did question myself along the way. My father started publicly dating a woman shortly after my mother died. I later learned she's likely the woman he'd been having an affair with before she died. I liked her. One evening my father took me to one side and asked how I'd feel about him asking her to marry him. I got an awful feeling in the pit of my stomach and felt nauseated. I told my father I didn't want him to and he asked why as he thought I liked her. I explained that I did like her but had a bad feeling and he said that's just a feeling. They don't mean anything. He already had the ring and proposed straight away. I got really excited about the engagement, the wedding, moving house, and my impending little sister. After the wedding she changed. After my half-sister was born, she went batshit. She abused me, my full sister, my mother's child, and later my half-sister, her own child. He only left her when my doctor told him something was clearly going on with her that was affecting my health. She was putting a substance that I'm intolerant to in my food, and my father wouldn't believe me and would force me to eat whatever she made. However, I couldn't get a doctor alone without her to tell them, and my maternal grandmother told him if he didn't leave her, she'd go for custody. He accused me of lying for the entire time leading up to that and has never asked me about any of my attempts to get help since. I was walking home late at night and I jokingly told my friend we're gonna get mugged due to just a weird feeling. Few minutes later, bang. Me and friend get mugged. I kind of jinxed myself by making that remark. But in the back of my head, walking home at dark that day was not meant to happen. Firstly, it was my brother's birthday, but I opted to go to play for a football match instead. Secondly, my parents offered to pick me up due to it being late at night, but being the ignorant guy, I declined. Sometimes there are warning signs before those weird feelings. There was a house in a street across mine that had multiple cartoons at the front wall and cameras over all the gates. It looked like a common daycare. But one day this gate was open and it was just a regular house. Sometime later, the police jailed the owner of the house for child abuse. He baited boys from the neighborhood to play his Nintendo 64 and such. Until today, I'm not really sure if one conversation I heard between two 10-12 years old boys was linked to this case. They were talking about how hard it becomes when you stick it in. They lived in that same street. I had a dream that my brother died the night before he did. Dream Friday night. Found dead of an overdose Saturday. But the dream was so real that I thought it had actually happened for years. My parents didn't tell us he'd died until Sunday, but I knew he was dead the whole weekend and was confused as to why they were acting like I didn't know, acting like I hadn't seen what I'd seen. I don't really believe in premonitions or anything, but that's something I'll never be able to explain. Still wonder how different life would be if the dream had woken me up and I went and said something to him. It was probably the defining event of my life when including everything that followed. I'm a member of a local Facebook group to help moms find babysitters. One of the admins was a mid-20s man who babysat for tons of kids in the area and specialized in caring for nonverbal and autistic children. His posts always gave me, and some other members, a weird vibe, but he was loved by this group as a whole. He was just arrested for molesting 2 children and possession of child porn. Bail is set at $2 million. It's estimated that he sat for over 500 children in our area. Who knows how many he abused. Aunt married her second husband and he just gave me the creeps. She came into the marriage with a daughter who was about 8 at the time. These were family we would only see maybe a couple times per year, and every time something about him gave me the heebies. Even as a 14-year-old boy, something felt really wrong. Fast forward 6-8 years later and we learn he molested my female cousin pretty much from the day he became her stepdad. Years of it. Aunt divorced him, but he's still around because they had additional kids together. I see him comment on FB posts of the cousin he molested. I'd love for him to die a slow and painful death. The sooner the better. I was vacationing in Mexico with my family when I was 11. I was alone on the beach. I thought I heard screams from far out in the water, but I couldn't be sure. I kept building my sand castle. The screams were my mother crying for help. She and my father and younger brother had been caught in a riptide. My father drowned while keeping my 9-year-old brother afloat long enough for rescue to arrive. If I had acted when I heard those screams, my dad would still be alive. In high school there were these 2 guys that were best friends. They always hung out with each and the other goth kids. Except, they were not exactly goth like the others. They wore military camo, jackboots, that sort of thing. I always had this weird feeling about them. They so stereotypically looked like they would shoot up the school. Well, after school was out in May of 2006, I was outside and heard this string of popping sounds way off. Fireworks, I thought. Lots of them. And continued on about my day. Turns out, one of those guys